Everyone in the county courthouse laughed when Eleanor Whitfield, a 68-year-old widow with cracked shoes and $40 to her name, raised her hand to buy a condemned boarded-up house for $100. They called her a foolish old woman throwing away money on a ruin nobody wanted. But none of them knew about the locked stone cellar beneath that house, and none of them knew that behind its rusted iron door sat a secret worth $50 million. The tax auction was held on a grey Tuesday morning in the basement of the Marshall County Courthouse, in a room that smelled of floor wax and old radiators. Eleanor Whitfield sat in the back row in her good coat, the only coat she owned that wasn't fraying at the cuffs, with her weathered hands folded in her lap and a small paper listing crumpled in her fist. She was 68 years old, and for the last 2 years she had been living in a single rented room above a laundromat on the edge of town, listening to the dryers spin beneath her floor until she fell asleep. It had not always been that way. Eleanor had once had a husband named Thomas, a schoolteacher with a warm laugh and a bad heart, and a small, comfortable house of their own. But Thomas had died 4 winters ago, and the medical bills that came after him had swallowed everything. The house, the savings, the little that was left. What the bills didn't take, Thomas's nephew Gerald had talked her out of in the confused, grieving months that followed, with papers she didn't fully understand and promises he never intended to keep. By the time Eleanor understood what had happened, she was 66 years old, alone and starting over with nothing but a monthly pension check that barely covered the room above the laundromat. She had not come to the auction to buy anything, really. She had come because she still, after everything, held on to one small, stubborn dream. The dream of having 4 walls that belonged to her again, a door she could lock that no one could talk her out of, a patch of ground that was hers. She came to these auctions the way some people go to church, not expecting a miracle, just needing to sit in the same room as hope. Most of the properties that morning went for tens of thousands of dollars, sold to men in pressed shirts who bid without emotion and tapped numbers into their phones. Eleanor watched them go, one after another, far beyond anything she could ever afford, and she felt the familiar quiet ache of a woman for whom every door had been closing for years. Then the auctioneer came to the last lot on the list. Lot 47. "Next we have the property at 12 Hollow Creek Road," the man read in a bored voice. 2-story farmhouse, approximately 90 years old, structure condemned, sold strictly as is. Back taxes owed, $100 even. Property has significant damage. Bank has no interest. Will open the bidding at $100. A ripple of low laughter moved through the room. Everyone there knew the house at Hollow Creek. A sagging, boarded-up ruin at the end of a dirt lane, its windows blind with plywood, its roof half caved in, swallowed by weeds and bramble. It had stood empty for as long as anyone could remember. The professionals didn't even look up from their phones. It was a tear-down at best, a liability at worst, a $100 hole you'd pour thousands into just to bulldoze. $100, the auctioneer repeated, already reaching for his gavel. Going once. Here. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but it carried in the still room. She had raised her hand. I'll take it. $100. Every head in the room turned to look at the small, elderly woman in the back row. The laughter came again, louder this time, less kind. A man in the front row twisted around in his seat and grinned at her. You sure, Grandma? That place'll fall on your head the minute you open the door. You'll spend more hauling away the rubble than the land's worth, another called out, and the room chuckled along. Eleanor did not lower her hand, and she did not look away. $100, she said again, steady and clear. The auctioneer shrugged, faintly amused. $100 to the lady in the back, going once, going twice, sold, for $100. The gavel came down with a flat crack. Congratulations, Ma'am, it's all yours. It took nearly everything she had. Eleanor counted out the money at the clerk's window in careful bills and coins. $100, leaving exactly $38 to her name until her next pension check. The clerk slid a folder across the counter with a set of old iron keys inside, gave her a look that was half pity and half amusement, and that was that. At 68 years old, with $38 in the world, Eleanor Whitfield owned a condemned house that everyone agreed was worthless, and she had never in her life felt richer. She drove out to Hollow Creek Road that same afternoon in her rattling old car, down a dirt lane so overgrown the branches scraped both windows at once. When the house finally came into view, even her stubborn hope faltered. It was worse than she remembered. The porch had collapsed on one side. Ivy had forced its way through the boards over the windows and was slowly pulling the whole front wall apart. The roof sagged like the spine of something old and tired. Birds had nested in the eaves. Something larger had denned beneath the porch. It looked less like a house than like the ghost of one, but Eleanor Whitfield had spent 4 years having things taken from her. She was done turning away from things. She parked the car, climbed out into the tall wet grass, and walked up to the front door of the house that was, at long last, entirely her own. The iron key turned in the swollen lock with a groan, and the door scraped open onto stale, dust-choked air. Inside, the house was a ruin. Plaster fallen from the ceilings, floorboards soft with rot, a staircase she didn't dare trust. Yellowed newspaper from decades past still curled on a kitchen table. Whoever had lived here had left in a hurry, long ago, and never come back. Eleanor moved through the rooms slowly, carefully, her heart aching with a strange tenderness for the poor broken place. She would clean it, she would fix what she could, one small piece at a time, with her own 2 hands. It didn't matter how long it took. She had time, and she had nowhere else she needed to be. It was near the back of the house, in what had once been a pantry, that she found the door. It was set into the floor, a heavy trapdoor of dark oak, banded with iron, half hidden beneath a fallen shelf and a thick blanket of dust. Unlike everything else in the rotting house, this door was solid, sound, deliberately built to last. And set into it was a heavy iron lock, red-brown with age, but entirely intact. Eleanor knelt beside it, her old knees protesting, and brushed the dust away with her palm. A cellar. The house had a cellar, and someone long ago had locked it and left it locked. She tried each of the iron keys from the clerk's folder in turn. None of them fit. The lock had been made for a key that was long gone. Now, a younger or a richer woman might have called someone, or simply left it for another day. But Eleanor had learned something in her long, hard years, that the things people take the trouble to lock away are the things that matter most. She thought of the covered, guarded weight of that door, so out of place, in a house where everything else had been left to rot. And she knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that she had to see what was underneath. It took her 3 days. She could not afford a locksmith. $38 did not stretch to such things. So Eleanor did what she had always done. She asked for help, honestly, from the only person left in her life who had never let her down. His name was Sam Coley, a widower in his 70s who ran the hardware store in town, a gruff, gentle man who had known Thomas years ago and who had quietly let Eleanor's small debts slide more than once. When she told him about the house and the locked cellar door, Sam didn't laugh the way the men at the auction had. He listened. Then he took an old canvas roll of tools down from a shelf, turned the sign on his door to closed, and said, "Well, let's go have a look then." It was Sam who finally worked the ancient lock loose on the 3rd evening, kneeling on the pantry floor with a headlamp and 40 years of patience. The old iron gave way with a deep, reluctant clunk, and the trapdoor swung upward on groaning hinges, breathing out cold air that smelled of stone and earth and time. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. Sam went first with the light, Eleanor close behind, one hand on the cold stone wall. The cellar was larger than the house above suggested, a broad, dry, stone-walled room, the air strangely cool and still. Sam's headlamp swept across the space, and both of them went utterly silent. The cellar was not empty. Against the far wall stood a row of wooden crates and old steamer trunks and shelves, and everywhere the light touched, it came back gold. On the shelves sat rows of frame paintings, wrapped in oilcloth that had rotted away to reveal the canvases beneath. Dark, rich old paintings in heavy gilded frames. In the open trunks lay silver, candlesticks, platters, whole services of it, tarnished black but unmistakable. And in a squat iron strongbox in the corner, its lid fallen open, gold coins lay heaped in the dust. Old coins, hundreds of them, glinting dully in the headlamp's beam. "Eleanor," Sam said quietly, and his voice was not quite steady. "Eleanor, I don't think this house was worthless at all." Eleanor could not answer him. She stood at the bottom of the stone stairs with one hand pressed to her mouth, and she looked at the treasure that had waited in the dark beneath a condemned house for who knew how many years, and slow tears ran down her weathered face. After everything that had been taken from her, the house, the savings, her husband, her dignity, she had raised her hand for a ruin nobody wanted, and the ruin had been keeping a secret all along. She stepped forward slowly, as though the whole cellar might vanish if she moved too fast, and reached out to touch the nearest painting. Beneath the rotted oilcloth, the canvas was dark with age, but she could make out the figures in it, a woman in a blue dress by a window, painted with such tenderness that even in the dim light it seemed almost to breathe. Her fingers trembled against the cold, gilded frame. On the shelf beside it, a set of silver candlesticks caught Sam's headlamp and threw the light back warm and soft. And in the iron strongbox in the corner, the gold coins lay heaped like something out of a story her mother had told her as a girl. A story she had stopped believing in a very long time ago. For 4 years, Eleanor Whitfield had woken every morning to the sound of dryers spinning beneath her rented floor, counting the days between pension checks, telling herself that this was simply what her life was now. That hope was a young woman's luxury she could no longer afford. And now she stood in a cold stone room, beneath a house the whole county had laughed at her for buying, surrounded by a fortune that had been waiting in the dark for someone, anyone, with enough stubborn faith to come looking. "I bought it for $100, she whispered, half to Sam and half to herself, as though saying it aloud might make it real. "They laughed at me, Sam. Every one of them laughed." "I know," Sam said gently, and there was a rough catch in his voice too. "I know they did." He looked around the cellar slowly at the paintings and the silver and the gold. "I don't think they'll be laughing much longer." But a discovery like that is never the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a new fight. Because Sam, ever careful, laid a hand on her arm before she could take another step. "We don't touch anything yet," he said gently. "A cellar like this, sealed up like this, it belonged to somebody once. Before you can call any of it yours, we have to find out whose it was, and we have to do it right so no one can ever take it from you." That single act of caution was what saved everything. They went to a lawyer the next morning. Not a fancy one, but an honest one. A woman named Ruth Delgado, who had practiced quietly in the county for 30 years and had never once been impressed by wealth. Ruth listened to their story, drove out to Hollow Creek herself, and stood in that cellar with a flashlight and a long, thoughtful silence. Then she began, methodically, to find out the truth. And the truth, when it came, was a remarkable one. The house at 12 Hollow Creek Road had belonged 90 years ago to a man named Augustus Hollow, the last heir of the family the creek itself was named for. Augustus had been a collector of art, of coins, of silver, of beautiful old things. He had also been a deeply distrustful man who lived through the Great Depression watching banks fail and fortunes vanish overnight, and so he had done what such men did. He had converted his wealth into things he could hold and hidden them where no bank and no government could reach. He had built the stone cellar himself, locked it, and told no one. And then Augustus Hollow had died suddenly, with no wife and no children, and no will that anyone could ever find. The house passed through distant, careless hands, none of whom knew about the locked cellar, until eventually it was simply abandoned, the taxes left unpaid, the doors boarded over, the whole thing forgotten and left to rot at the end of a dirt lane. For decades, a fortune had lain untouched beneath a house the whole county agreed was worthless, because the one man who knew the secret had taken it to his grave. "Which means," Ruth Delgado explained, sitting across from Eleanor in her small office, "there is no living heir with any claim. The estate was never settled. The property was legally auctioned by the county for unpaid taxes in a lawful public sale, and you, Eleanor, are the lawful buyer. Under the law, when you bought that house, you bought everything permanently affixed to it and everything abandoned within it. The cellar and its contents are part of the property." Ruth set down her pen. "It's yours, all of it. And once we have it appraised and properly recorded, no one on earth will be able to take it from you." The appraisal took 2 weeks and 3 specialists, and when the final number came, Eleanor had to sit down. The paintings alone included 2 works by a 19th century master thought to have been lost to history, museum pieces worth millions each. The gold coins were rare mint editions. The silver was antique and complete. Altogether, the contents of the locked cellar beneath the $100 house were valued at just over $50 million. $50 million. Eleanor Whitfield, who 2 weeks earlier had counted out her last $100 at a courthouse window while a room full of strangers laughed, was now a very wealthy woman. But wealth, once it becomes known, has a way of summoning the very people who never cared about you when you had nothing. The story made the local paper first, and then the regional news. Widow buys condemned house for $100, finds $50 million fortune inside. And it was in the pages of that newspaper that Gerald, Thomas's nephew, the same Gerald who had smoothly talked a grieving widow out of her home and savings 4 years earlier, saw Eleanor's photograph and understood all at once exactly what he had let slip through his fingers. Within a week, Eleanor received a letter from Gerald's lawyer. Within 2, there was a lawsuit. Gerald's claim was a brazen one. He argued that as Thomas's closest living relative, he was the rightful heir to any Whitfield family property, and that Eleanor, as merely Thomas's widow, had been acting on behalf of the family when she purchased the house. The fortune, his lawyers insisted, belonged by rights to the Whitfield bloodline, of which Gerald was the head. He, who had taken Eleanor's home while she was still in mourning, now stood in front of a local news camera in an expensive suit and called her a confused old woman who had stumbled into money she couldn't possibly manage, money that belonged with family. "My aunt is elderly, and she's been through a great deal," Gerald said smoothly to the camera, his face a mask of false concern. "We only want what's best for her, and what's fair for the family. That fortune is part of the Whitfield legacy. It's the right thing for it to stay in the family's hands." Eleanor watched that interview from Ruth Delgado's office, and for the first time since the auction, the old fear came creeping back. The fear of a woman who had already been robbed once by this exact man, with papers she hadn't understood, in a grief she couldn't see past. Her hands began to tremble. But Ruth Delgado only leaned back in her chair and very quietly began to smile. "Eleanor," she said, "he's made a serious mistake. He's argued in a court of law that he's entitled to the Whitfield family's property. But that house was never Whitfield property. It belonged to Augustus Hollow, a man Gerald has no relation to whatsoever. Gerald has no claim to that estate, none, And in reaching for this fortune, he's about to put something on the record that I don't think he's thought through at all. The weeks before the hearing were the hardest Eleanor had known since Thomas died. Gerald's lawyers filed motion after motion, each one a fresh attempt to freeze the estate, to question her competence, to paint her in the county's eyes as a bewildered old woman who did not know her own mind. Reporters called the laundromat. Strangers stopped her on the street, some kind, some cruel, all of them certain they knew what should be done with money that was not theirs. There were nights Eleanor lay awake in her small room and wondered whether it might be simpler, after all, to just let Gerald have it, the way she had once let him have everything else, if only the noise would stop. But then she would remember the cellar. She would remember raising her hand in that courthouse while the whole room laughed, and the small, stubborn voice inside her that had refused, for once, to sit down and be quiet. And she would decide, one more time, to fight. The case came before a judge 6 weeks later, in the same county courthouse where Eleanor had raised her hand for a $100 ruin. Gerald arrived with 2 well-dressed attorneys and the easy confidence of a man who had bullied his way to what he wanted his whole life. He did not so much as glance at his aunt as he passed her in the aisle. Eleanor arrived in her one good coat, with Sam Coley on one side of her and Ruth Delgado on the other, and she sat very straight in her seat, and she did not look away when Gerald finally did turn to smirk at her across the room. Gerald's lawyers spoke first, and they spoke of family and legacy and the vulnerability of an elderly widow and the fairness of keeping a fortune within the bloodline. It sounded, to the untrained ear, almost reasonable. Then Ruth Delgado rose, and she asked the court a single simple question. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff claims this fortune belongs to the Whitfield family, but the property at Hollow Creek Road, and everything within it, belonged to the estate of a man named Augustus Hollow, a man to whom the plaintiff has no blood relation, no legal tie, and no connection of any kind. So I would ask the plaintiff's counsel to explain to this court, on what possible basis does Mr. Gerald Whitfield claim to inherit the estate of a man he is not related to?" The courtroom was silent. Gerald's attorneys shuffled their papers. They had built their entire case on the assumption that this was Whitfield family money. And it was not, and never had been. "There is more, Your Honor," Ruth continued, and now her voice hardened. "The plaintiff describes himself as a devoted family member acting in his aunt's best interest. So I would like to enter into the record the property transfers of 4 years ago. The documents by which this same devoted nephew acquired the home and savings of a grieving widow 3 months after her husband's funeral, using powers of attorney she has testified she did not understand." She laid a thick folder on the bench. "The plaintiff has not come to this court to protect Eleanor Whitfield's interests. The plaintiff has a documented history of stripping this woman of everything she owned the moment she was too grief-stricken to defend herself. And now that she has finally, lawfully found something of her own, he has appeared once again, not as family, but as a predator who has smelled blood in the water a second time." The judge, an older man with a long memory of the tricks played in his courtroom, spent a long time reading the folder Ruth had submitted. He read the property transfers. He read the powers of attorney. He read Gerald's own sworn claim to be the heir of a man he had no relation to, and when at last he looked up, his expression was cold. "Mr. Whitfield," the judge said, "I have reviewed your claim. You assert that you are entitled to the estate of Augustus Hollow, to whom you have demonstrated no relation whatsoever. That claim has no basis in law, and I dismiss it entirely. Furthermore, the record before me suggests a documented pattern of financial exploitation of the defendant that this court finds deeply troubling. Troubling enough that I will be referring these earlier transfers to the state's attorney for review." He set the folder down hard. The property at Hollow Creek Road was lawfully purchased at public auction by Eleanor Whitfield. Its contents belong to her, in full and without qualification. This suit is dismissed with prejudice. And Mr. Whitfield, I would advise you to secure a very good attorney of your own. You are going to need one." The gavel fell. Gerald sat frozen at his table, the colour draining from his face as the full weight of what he had done settled over him. In his greed to seize a fortune that was never his, he had marched into a courtroom and handed a judge a documented trail of how he had robbed his own widowed aunt 4 years before. The home and savings he had stolen would now be examined by the state's attorney. He had reached for $50 million that could never be his, and in doing so had finally put a noose around his own neck. He left the courthouse that day with nothing but the certainty of the reckoning to come. Eleanor did not watch him go. She sat quietly in her good coat between the two people who had stood by her, and she let out a long breath she felt she had been holding for 4 years. The $50 million did not change Eleanor Whitfield in the ways such money changes lesser people. She was 68 years old, and she had learned long ago the exact weight of what mattered and what did not. The first thing she did, before anything for herself, was walk into Sam Coley's hardware store, set aside the small debts he had carried for her over the years, and quietly make certain that Sam, who had turned his sign to closed and knelt on a dusty pantry floor for 3 evenings to help an old friend, would never want for anything for the rest of his days. He protested, of course. She did not listen. Some debts, she told him, are not the kind that appear on any ledger, and those are the only ones worth repaying in full. Then she did the thing she had dreamed of through 2 long years above a laundromat. She restored the house at Hollow Creek Road. Not as a museum and not as a mansion, but as a home, warm and solid and whole, with a porch that no longer sagged and windows that let the light in and a door, at long last, that belonged entirely to her and that no one could ever talk her out of again. The stone cellar she left exactly as it was, empty now and swept clean, its heavy oak door propped open to the light, a reminder of the secret that had waited there so long for someone who would take the trouble to look. And with the rest, the great bulk of Augustus Hollow's hidden fortune, Eleanor did something that would have made her schoolteacher husband proud. She established a fund in Thomas's name, quietly, without her photograph in any paper this time, a fund to help elderly widows and widowers who had lost their homes the way she nearly had, to grief, to medical debt, to the smiling relatives who circle the newly bereaved like patient birds. She had learned, in the hardest way a person can learn it, how easily the world takes everything from someone who is alone and in mourning and too broken to fight back. And so she built something to stand between those people and the Geralds of the world. She could not undo what had been done to her, but she could make certain that her suffering became a shield for someone else. On a golden evening the following autumn, Eleanor sat on the mended porch of the house that everyone had laughed at her for buying, a cup of tea warm in her weathered hands, and watched the sun go down over Hollow Creek. Sam Coley sat in the chair beside her, the two of them easy in the comfortable silence of old friends. The house at her back was warm and full of light. The dirt lane, cleared now, ran clean down to the road. "You know," Sam said after a while, "half the county still can't get over it. An old woman pays $100 for a house they all called a tear-down, and it turns out to be the richest thing for miles." He shook his head slowly. "Every one of those men in fancy shirts looked right at that place and saw nothing but a ruin." Eleanor smiled, watching the last of the light gild the tops of the trees. She thought of the auction and the laughter and the small, stubborn hope that had carried her to raise her hand when every voice in the room told her not to. "They looked at that house and saw everything that was broken about it," she said softly. "I looked at it and saw that it was mine." She wrapped both hands around her warm cup. "People will always tell you that the thing you love is worthless, Sam. Sometimes they're even right about how it looks. But every now and then, the ruin that everyone else has given up on is the one holding a treasure. and all it ever needed was for someone to stop laughing long enough to look underneath. If Eleanor's journey from a rented room above a laundromat to the home and the justice she finally deserved moved you tonight, please take a moment to tap that like button. It genuinely helps us share stories like this with the people who need them most. On this channel, we bring you real tales of hidden fortunes, hard-won justice, and ordinary people who refuse to give up, even when the whole world had counted them out. Share this video with someone who still believes that good people get their second chance, and subscribe so you never miss another story. And tell us in the comments below, if you had opened that locked cellar door and seen what Eleanor saw, what is the very first thing you would have done? We'll see you in the next one.